Hey, welcome back to the Progressive Brothers podcast. I'm here with my co-host.
Hey everyone, welcome
Renaissance
back.
Man.
Please like the video, share, and subscribe. And peace to everyone in the chat.
And hit that notification bell so you get all the updates from the Progressive Brothers podcast. This is episode 19. Today's topic is the Centennial anniversary of the race massacre on Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But before we get to that, Renaissance, do you have anything you want to bring up in terms of what's being discussed tonight?
In addition to what we're discussing with the Tulsa race massacre, I didn't know this, and I thought I'd share it. Obviously, we had Memorial Day yesterday, on Monday technically, and I did not know that there was actually some Black history behind Memorial Day. Essentially,
Explain that Black history.
Back in the 1860s, right after the post-Civil War, you had Blacks in, I believe it's Charleston, South Carolina, who discovered a mass grave of Black soldiers, Black Union soldiers, who were basically being held as prisoners of war in that area by the Confederacy. Obviously, the Confederacy lost. Basically, upon finding this mass grave, what they did is they actually created a formal burial for everyone. So I believe they dug the bodies up, created coffins, and actually gave them individual plots, and actually built a structure as well, and had a celebration of their lives. And I mean, got people in the town involved, had almost like a parade, a celebration of their lives. And that is what one historian, and this is in Time magazine, you can actually, we'll link the article in the docket below, but they basically, the author of the story essentially says that this is what is believed to be the first sort of, incident of a Memorial Day. And this is sort of the starting point when other historians have previously referenced other points that, to their knowledge, this is the actual starting point of Memorial Day. So just a piece of Black history there that I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of people aren't aware of. So that, coupled with Tulsa, and then as well as you have Juneteenth coming up, just sort of a mini Black History Month. A lot of major events that are starting to gain more and more attention in the mainstream society.
Yeah, absolutely. And during that Civil War, Black people played a instrumental role in actually defeating the Confederate military, the Confederate Army in the South. So it's just one of those things that, Black people, Black men especially, played significant roles in radically changing society with their contributions. But for today, that coincides with the centennial anniversary of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the race massacre or the riot or whatever you want to call it. It was an event that, from my perspective, it actually should be considered a terrorist event because it was definitely political. Race is a political component to Western society. It's a social construct that is built into the fabric of the development of America, the United States of America. And so anytime you attack a specific group of people based on their race and their ethnicity for the objective of, destroying their place within the society itself or disrupting their place within the society itself, is definitely politically motivated. So I would definitely call it a terrorist style event, similar to 9/11, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, most certainly. Like I said, from my reading, there's still a lot that is going on surrounding, because I've heard it referenced as multiple things. I've heard it referenced as the Tulsa race riot, and I've heard it referenced as the Tulsa race massacre. I'm hearing more of massacre now, and my understanding is actually that archaeologists as we're speaking, are beginning or preparing to actually do a dig in and around Tulsa, because I believe by the official record, I can't remember the exact number, but there's some
300.
there is some belief that there's even more people who could have been killed in this. So they're actually having people going and digging. They found, I believe, 12 caskets recently that they want to see if this is another mass grave that people could have been basically thrown in, and that number could go up. Now, there is some speculation that there was something like a sort of a health plague that occurred. So maybe, those bodies are not associated with the massacre. It could be associated with that, but it's generating more and more insight. You want to say something?
No, I was just going to add to that. The military has all types of radar ground penetration tools that they can use to determine what's under the surface. Could they use it for mine sweeping and things of that nature? They can definitely see what's under the ground, especially in a shallow grave. To determine, bone density scans and things like that. They can definitely spot anything up under that ground. Most archaeologists would be able to determine that as well, because they also have multiple tools that they use for excavation and things of that nature. So it shouldn't be difficult in 2021 to figure out if there's something under there.
I think they'll find. My understanding is they found the actual bodies. I think it's more of just determining, are these associated with the Tulsa Race Massacre as well, or is this associated with something else? Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say they kept, the insurance companies and the banks kept a meticulous record of everybody who had deposits and who had insurance coverage. So they'd be able to determine where everybody lived and what block they lived on and what the radius was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they'd be able to find out where those people would be in an approximate. I mean, it's only 35 blocks. It's not that much. We're not talking about excavating the ocean right now. We're talking about 35 blocks.
And it's funny you mentioned insurance, because I'm not sure how much people in the audience or how much knowledge they have surrounding this, but no one was ever compensated for the Tulsa Race Massacre. No one was compensated, and no one was ever prosecuted. As well as the insurance companies, they actually refused money to people to actually rebuild. They denied their claims. So this had major effects, because from the little bit that I've seen recently, I've seen more previously, not as sharp on as much details as I am on others, but I mean, this area was very prosperous. You're talking about luxury movie theaters, luxury hotels, doctors, lawyers, people owning their own airplanes, just a very prosperous society in the 1920s. Little background on the actual Tulsa. What attracted people there was essentially the oil boom. Blacks as well as whites moved to that area because of the oil boom. That area was obviously doing pretty well, and because of segregation, people who were black were basically forced to work among themselves, and they basically built this area which was called Greenwood, this area of Tulsa that was the Greenwood district, and it became so prosperous. It was Booker T. Washington who actually gave it the name Black Wall Street. So, yep, go ahead.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah,
no, I was just agreeing.
That's the background. And like I said, this area that was very prosperous was destroyed essentially on the accusation that a black man had assaulted a white woman. Black man, I can't remember his name, was entering an elevator. The elevator operator was a white female. There's speculation as to whether he stepped on her shoe or like there was a boom that was nearby or something, but this woman essentially screamed, and people word basically through rumors spread through newspapers, things like that this black man had assaulted this woman, and that was the impetus for the beginning of the riot, where you saw essentially white militia grabbing guns and basically shooting black people on sight, as well as even the National Guard dropping bombs on this town. So my understanding, the only structure, ironically, that was left standing was the AME Church.
Yeah, the person's name was Dick Rowland. Yeah, and the thing is, this was all pre-planned. So you're talking about Tulsa, the government itself, the Tulsa Police Department, deputized all of these random white male civilians who participated in the harassing and killing of people, black people on that side. And then you talk about the National Guard who helped facilitate that with arms and material and manpower. So you're talking about a division or two divisions of the National Guard. I think a division is something like 5,000 troops at that. Something to that effect. Maybe back then might have been 5,000 troops for a National Guard division. So you're talking about against black people who only made up 10,000 people. They were pretty much overrun by law enforcement and National Guard and basically random terrorists.
That's where you sort of see, like I said, the coordination of the fact that you were able to have these people who essentially were, because I believe the massacre did not last truly that long. I want to say like a couple, 3 days maybe, but you're able to destroy 36 blocks and have the, like you said, law enforcement as well as the National Guard participate. So there was clearly, this was something that had an element of premeditation, and really people were looking for an excuse out of resentment and jealousy.
Yeah, very functional society. They had every element of what makes a society work, from all of the businesses, enterprises, to a hospital and a library and
doctors, lawyers,
utility grids. You had utility grid as well, and they also had the energy, right? So they were pumping oil out of the ground, which is what gave them the immense wealth. They were the Saudi Arabia of today, of back then. I'm saying they discovered oil before Saudi Arabia did. So what I'm saying here is they had all of the necessary means to create a functional society, which is what they did. 10,000 people doesn't sound like a lot today, but back then that's a lot of people to be in one little section of a city. And so, and keep in mind that what divided them in the city wasn't just the color of their skin, but it was actually the railroad that intersected between them and the white South.
Yeah, and my understanding too, and I don't know if you've heard this as well, but if I remember correctly, I think even as well as claims being denied and no one ever being paid out, they were able to build back some of the area, not obviously to what it once was, but I think there was they faced hurdles. I think the city tried to push back on them even doing that as well, on building back. So it wasn't just like that was the end of just destroying it. They tried to permanently make sure it didn't return.
Yeah, definitely. And they also looted those banks. They didn't just, burn it down. They actually looted them. So they took a lot of the heirlooms that were there, because they had safe boxes and stuff like that was set up back then. So they made sure they went after the assets that were of value, considerable value back then. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah. It goes to show you. I think one of the things that comes to mind is the overarching theme from what I've read was that people were resentful of Black progress, and tying that going forward. I was listening to a short film, a short documentary on January 6th, and the author who had basically done this research, he was a professor, he was saying one of the main indicators for people who went and participated in this riot they were people from areas where they perceived that the non-white population was essentially moving ahead, that they were making progress, and that they felt that they were making progress at a faster rate than them. And these were people who had that sort of idea who were most likely to participate in January 6th, because traditionally we've heard January 6th, it was initially kind of spun as these are poor people, these are, lower class, working class whites, people who are, struggling. And, when he did the research, he was like, well, not really. When you look at this breakdown of this population, you see a lot of former law enforcement, or current law enforcement, a lot of former military, current military, and a large professional slash business owning class. Roughly about 40% of that population was, white collar or business owner. So I think you're starting to see that same sentiment creep up, in the sense of, you can make the argument of, a Trump presidency, that was sort of a backlash against the rise of Barack Obama and resentment there. And, with the changing demographics of America, this sentiment is still there. And I think that's kind of telling to people who pull the respectability arguments card of, the reason why there's racism in American society is because black people commit crimes, they walk around with their pants down, all of these things. This is sort of, I guess you could say, something that neutralizes that argument, in the sense of, hey, when you see these people were professional, they were moving forward, they were making progress, they were striving, and that made them even more of a target. And that's what I think a lot of these people who call themselves conservatives and really run with a lot of these talking points, that's one of the things I think they need to take notice of and realize, is that, hey, black progress is an issue with some of these people. And it's going to draw resentment. And like I said, I see those two parallels with January 6th, what's going on in this country, and what happened back then.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also add, I think just lack of black subordination is a problem for them, because even though black people were poor back then, right? Because Tulsa was an exception and not the rule, right? Black people weren't thriving like that back then. It was just the exception. Even when black people in the South were poor, they still persisted that you couldn't drink at the same water fountain as them, right? So I don't think it's so much just about black progress, but just black existence. Like, there is a desire to emasculate not just black men, but the community as a whole, to kind of drive them into a position where they're so disadvantaged that the ability to keep them disadvantaged is almost, their identity for white people is predicated off of keeping them at disadvantage, if that makes any sense. And so they have to keep black people in this position in order for them to feel good about themselves, because that's where their identity lies at. And so I think when it comes to Black Wall Street and transitioning into January 6th, Black Wall Street, they set up concentration camps. A lot of people don't notice. They put concentration camps set up. They corralled a lot of these black people, especially black women, into these concentration camps and kept them in there for a substantial amount of time. And they did this in coordination with the government. It wasn't like the government didn't know about this. They actually helped facilitate a lot of this. But it was the veterans who were outnumbered almost 1 to 10 in terms of defending Black Wall Street. It's really interesting to see this sort of similar perspective that happened back then, where black men had to defend the environment, in January 6th, where you had black men who helped defend the Capitol in the capacity that they did. Yeah,
very true. To what your point you were saying about white identity, I think that's a very good point. I think it also ties back to the legacy of slavery. I think there are people who, because of that legacy and how the country was founded and black people's status in that founding, there are some people who have never really, you could say, adjusted to seeing people as full citizens. I mean, that was one of the things, or as even humanity. I mean, that was one of the things that, they talked about in Reconstruction and other eras is, hey, these people just walked off the plantation. How are they going to be, our equals? How are they going to fit in proper society? How am I going to see them as an equal or see them as nothing more than a former slave? And I think there's an element of that's still, that attitude is still very much ingrained within the society, because it's very hard in general to change attitudes and culture. And when you put how bitter at times change has come through the Civil War, Reconstruction, end of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, how bitterly those battles have been fought back and forth. I think there's an element of that, like you said, with identity, that's ingrained in this. And like I said, that was clearly demonstrated with the massacre, because like I said, no one was ever compensated, and they've been. My understanding is this has been something that they've been trying to get mass attention brought to for a while now. I remember seeing something, I believe it was 60 Minutes a few years back, where they talked about this, and there's a push for reparations. And they essentially said, I believe an Oklahoma council even recommended that there needed to be reparations, but nothing has been done. And, essentially one of the lawyers or the people representing the legal strategy and trying to bring awareness to this said they think these people, that they're essentially trying to wait for all the survivors to die off. And, that way you can say, oh, well, everyone's dead and we can't really do anything about it because they're gone now. Because you do have survivors. I saw an interview, as well as she testified in front of Congress. I believe the woman was 107 years old, who is a survivor. And, she talks about still having nightmares, not being able to sleep, hearing noises because, she's lived through that. It's just clearly something that people have tried to keep buried. I've heard lots of people say that they never heard about this or learned about it in school, which I was one of them. I learned about it through my own research and coming across it. I learned about it probably about 6 or 7 years ago. So it's something that, and I have heard people mention that they did learn about it in school as well, but it seems like something that's been largely suppressed. And I even saw a professor who studied it who said, hey, he grew up, hearing rumors about it in his community, but it was very hushed, and people tried to basically prevent this from being made public. So I think it's good that it's become public, but I think the question becomes now, okay, what do we do to fix this? Because like we said, the community never recovered. This is one of the wealthier areas in Black America at that time, and you have survivors who were never made whole. So it will be interesting to see if anything can be done.
Well, to that point, in order to get reparations, you would have to do a forensic analysis on what exactly happened and who was involved and who was impacted. And that involves critical race theory, something that a lot of conservatives are against. In fact, the governor of Oklahoma actually passed a bill to ban the teaching of critical race theory that would empower reparations to be doled out to the Tulsa victims. He did that recently, I think it was last week. And so this is the sort of mentality that's involved in the state itself. We see it down to the mayor level of Tulsa, who's a Republican himself, who doesn't think that he actually posted a few hours ago that he's apologizing for the Tulsa massacre. I mean, timing is everything, right? It's of the essence. But he was recently, as I think of last week or maybe the other day, saying that he doesn't believe that white people of today should pay for the crimes of a few white people of yesterday, of that time. I mean, that's the sort of mentality that you have on the right, on the conservative side, where they don't feel that Black people should be compensated for anything, but they have no problem giving $3.8 billion to Israel for their security. So they're willing to spend billions of dollars to fund another country, that came after the fact of, Tulsa, right? Israel is a state that was artificially created in 1948. You're talking about 25 to 30 years after Tulsa. So this is the mentality that goes on, when it comes to reparations and conservatism, that they don't believe that, Black people have a place within not just Tulsa, but just in American society, Western society. They don't believe democracy belongs to them. The Constitution shouldn't apply to them. And civil rights is somehow negatively impacting white people, and because Black people have the same rights. That's just the way how they see it.
Yeah, what happened to America first? With your comment about foreign aid funding versus making whole American citizens. But to your point on him apologizing, that's something that was never done. So that's a first in and of itself. It's not anything major, but it's an acknowledgement that, hey, that the government was responsible or bear some responsibility in this. But to this point, you hadn't even had an apology surrounding this event. So it just shows how much this is something that people really didn't want to deal with in American history. Kind of been something that's been swept under the rug, and people have been trying to keep it there. The other thing that will be interesting too is, for me, because of the timing of it, I wonder if it's just 100 years. Since it's 100 years, it seems like it's going to get a lot of publicity, this year. But what is it going forward? Is it something that we continually are going to remember? Is it going to be a catalyst to look at other instances across the country that occurred? Because this is not the only one. You have places like Rosewood in Florida, Wilmington, North Carolina. That we talked about it, maybe not on the Brain Trust, but on another panel. This was not a race massacre, but you had a Black man and woman in California who built a resort, and basically the Klan threatened them. When that didn't work, the government actually seized the land from them, and they had to give up their resort. And that land is now worth like $30 million. There is a push to try to return that to them. So it will be interesting if this can spark a catalyst to a greater acknowledgement of other instances of really Black wealth being destroyed. Because the more and more that is reinforced, the more and more this narrative of, hey, the reason that the Black community is poor is because, people buy rims and put rims on their cars. They buy Air Jordan tennis shoes. That's why Black people have, the wealth gap that they do to whites. It has nothing to do with generational wealth and, land theft and, land grab schemes and, like I said, massacres and theft of wealth. That has nothing to do with it, So hopefully this will bring more and more awareness to that narrative, not just for the greater society, but for other Black people as well, because there are lots of Black people that I've heard who said that, they didn't know about this until recently.
Yeah, you compound that with government policies for redlining. You compound that with other sort of Jim Crow sort of laws at that time. I mean, you're talking about Jim Crow lasted 100 years. It wasn't something like, a lot of people think it ended in the 60s. It actually, basically continued all the way into the 70s for most states.
Yeah. It varied as far as, what you were dealing with. You may have had black and white water fountains that disappeared, but when you start talking about things like protective covenants and sundown towns, housing discrimination, desegregation, integration of schools, all of these things took time. And, I believe it was Malcolm X who mentioned, when he talked about, Brown v. Ford was in, I believe, 1954. And, 10 years later, you had like less than 10% compliance with the ruling because of, the wording that the Supreme Court used with deliberate, and I believe deliberate and appropriate speed. So, pretty much opened the door for people to do everything to drag their feet to towards any sort of progress. So you're right. It wasn't just like a court case happened and boom, everything was good.
No, they didn't desegregate schools in Boston, if not the state of Massachusetts, until about 74. So I think that was the first ones. So and separate busing, segregated busing as well. I think that didn't end into the 70s. And so a lot of people underestimate the impact of an ideology that has largely subjugated a small demographic of people and stymied them from ever having any sort of potential equitable growth. And it's that sort of thinking that doesn't allow for a prosperous society. A lot of people want to work from a perspective of rugged individualism, but don't realize they're attacking the collective. They're not attacking the individual. Nobody was safe during Tulsa. Everybody can get it, including the kids, right? If you listen to the testimony, a woman who ran outside of her house to get out because they were gonna basically throw petrol bombs inside the house, had to leave with her baby in her arms. That was the only thing she had left on her, was the clothes on her back and her child. And she had to literally run, 2, 3, 4 blocks just to get away. And you had military Gatling guns sitting on top of on hilltops, shooting down at black people randomly, just shooting, indiscriminately, hitting people. That's why there was so many, deaths, up in the 100, 200, 300 people, because they were shooting people from long distance. You had snipers, infantry fire on top of them, and then you had incendiary bombs being dropped from planes. This is something that, if Russia or China was doing something like this, there would be sanctions and more sanctions on top of them. Whether if it was Iran or Syria, we always hear about Assad is gassing his people. We must put sanctions on him. He has to go. Assad has to go. We'll talk about communism and socialism and Marxism, but we never talk about the significance of Jim Crow in Oklahoma, Tulsa, and how it impacted black people and what was the outcome of that. No one ever wants to talk about that. Tulsa was basically back then what Silicon Valley is today.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tulsa was the first instance of the U.S. government using its own military to bomb its own civilian population, correct? Okay.
Yeah, that was the first time planes were used.
Okay, yeah, because
planes were relatively new.
I thought that was the first time because I believe the second time, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the only 2 times that something like that has happened has been against black people, and that was Tulsa and the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia back in, I guess, the 80s, 70s or 80s.
Yeah, they use incendiary C4 bombs on a house and actually caught fire and burned other houses in the neighborhood, which was a catastrophe in itself.
Here you have the only 2 instances of military force being used against American citizens in that form, and no surprise, it's against the black community. Like I said, the first one is Tulsa, and I want to say that may have been actually how I first learned about Tulsa. Now that I think about it, was having someone or learning about the fact that, hey, there is an instance of military force being used against American citizens. Because for those of you who don't know, that's using military force against your community is considered against the citizenry in the United States is considered a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. So you do have National Guard, which can be deployed to help calm a situation, restore order, but using the actual military is a no-go.
The Sons of the Confederates in Wilmington, North Carolina, that you referred to earlier, they were the ones who actually used military-grade hardware to drive out, the black community, because it wasn't just a black Wall Street, but black people were actually in political power. So it was a coup d'etat that happened. It wasn't just, they went down to some random houses. No, they overthrew the government there.
Yeah, and that dynamic brings up another interesting dynamic too. Because we've heard people talk about, oh well, we don't need to focus on politics. We just need to focus on economics, this and that. Well, here you have two instances of, one instance you have a community that has economic and political power, and you see what happens to it with Wilmington, and then you have another city where they just have economic power, and look what happens to it. Same outcome. And then you've seen, if you were just looking at other places in the South, prior to Jim Crow with Reconstruction, and then after Jim Crow and the end of Jim Crow, when people were just seeking political power, you see the resentment that it caused there, and then the suppression of votes during Jim Crow, and then the violence and terrorism that was used to prevent people from ending voter suppression and gaining the right to vote. And it's like you kind of see that coming full circle again with a perceived threat of black political power. You could even argue black economic power, because that seems to be, if you look at the places where a lot of these bills are being passed, places like Georgia with Atlanta, Texas with Houston, Dallas, places like Arizona with Phoenix, major urban areas, large black populations, North Carolina as well. You can throw that in with Raleigh, Durham, as well as Charlotte. Areas that have sizable black populations, successful economic black populations. It's kind of the same full story, just like I said, coming full circle of a pushback to perceived progress, whether it be economic or, in this case, what we're mainly seeing, voting power.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? You're seeing all, legislation being swept through multiple places, even as we speak right now, Texas especially, and you have like the fracturing of the GOP itself. It's just political chaos happening, all on the cusp of economic mobility and political mobility of African Americans in America. They just have a problem with the idea that black people can actually be a part of the same system and have equality under the same rules of the law. And unfortunately, we'll see what happens in 2022. I think 2022 is going to be telling for what happens in 2024. Especially if they get this reparations bill deal in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because Maxine Waters is overseeing. She's in charge of the Financial Services Committee, I think. I think that's the branch that she covers, and so that involves insurance companies and that involves banks, and the insurance companies and banks that were involved in denying Tulsa residents support for their claims are going to be brought up while she's in office. So we'll see what happens. I think this is going to be an interesting time. I mean, there's a lot of things that have been shaken up. No one knew that George Floyd would get $27 million. No one knew that Breonna Taylor would get that kind of money in such a short amount of time. Usually that stuff takes years and years to accrue, but we're seeing this happening in less than 90 days, after the convictions happen, right? So I think with Tulsa, I think this is probably the right time for it to take place.
One thing that comes to mind, and I was going to ask you, do you think there's any negative that could come out of this, in the sense of, like I was talking to someone earlier, they kind of thought that, hey, sometimes things can get too sort of blown up and mainstream where, people sort of, it gets recognition, but it kind of just becomes like, oh, we'll do this, and what really needs to be done, kind of gets ignored or sort of swept under. So kind of like, hey, we'll give all this attention, we'll make all these documentaries, we'll put up monuments and things, but the real work that actually needs to be done is never really taken care of, or will give you some semblance of repair, through, because I've heard of things like, hey, assistance or grants or things like that, but will never really address the real issue. Do you think you can run the risk of that with how much publicity this has gained?
I think it can have both positive and negative, right? It can bring a lot of resentment up, because you can have, like, similar to Holocaust deniers. To this very day, you still have people denying the Holocaust, and you also can have the justification for critical race theory that comes out of it. I think that's the political piece, but I think from an economic piece, I think that if you're a bank, if you're a financial institution, if you're an insurance company or anything like that, you're probably sitting on pins and needles saying, "Oh shit, right? We can't just pull any more tricks like we did before, right? 2008, we were doling out subprime mortgages to black people, and that really caused the market to take a serious dip and if not crash, right? Now you're under the microscope. If you're a financial institution, if you're an insurance company, if you're any of these sort of institutions that involved in sort of doing business from a transactional standpoint that involves underrepresented people, yeah, you can get it too out here. So now you're forced to actually comply with financial regulations. And so to your question, and to answer your question, it's a negative and a positive, but I think the positive is gonna outweigh the negative going forward.
Yeah, like I said, we can only hope. Like I said, this is it's been a long time coming. It's been something, like I said, that people have actively tried to suppress, keep out of the news, and now it seems to have gone center stage, and everyone knows about it. So we'll see what the next steps are. Hopefully, like I said, there is some recompense, as well as more study, more clarification on what occurred, as well as the truth. Well, I shouldn't say truth, but as well as, I guess, a true telling in history as well, because you're seeing that with critical race theory and the banning of it in schools in general. From what I've seen, it seems like more of a, hey, we're really going to try to ban people talking about race in general. So you've already seen textbooks try to say, not even mention slavery or call slaves indentured servants. So just making sure that the history and the way it's presented is reframed and mentioned in a way that is accurate, and it's not able to be whitewashed like so many things. Because I shared a tweet with you and some other people offline of Jelani Cobb essentially saying that him and his black colleagues had talked to numerous people, numerous white Tulsans or co-workers about it, and it's essentially, they either tried to play it off like, oh, it wasn't as bad as these people were reporting it, or some people outright saying, they didn't believe it occurred really. And it's just like you said, with Holocaust deniers, it's like you already have, if you have people with that mentality already who are reacting to this stuff that way, just like how now you have the spotlight on it. If you're not careful, people can try to whitewash it after things die down in the history books, or try to run misdirection where, hey, you get all this spotlight and attention, but like I said, you really don't do anything, and there's really no substantive change that happens when it comes to teaching of the history and making survivors whole.
Well, we can look at it from another perspective. This will be my last statement. Biden, a month or so ago, basically admitted to the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Empire, and so the United States was the last country to hold out in terms of admitting to the Armenian genocide. Obama held out on it, and many other presidents held out on it, but Biden was the first one to really come forward in the United States to come out and say and admit that the genocide was real, and that thousands of Armenians were ethnically cleansed during the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. And so I'm saying now, if Biden's coming out and basically admitting, I watched his speech earlier and I thought it was really, really good. Not sure who wrote it, but that was really good. If he's admitting that this was basically a terrorist attack on the Black community, and you have Google and Facebook and these tech companies that are basically going to put a check mark next to something or flag it as being misinformation or disinformation, I think this is a game changer, because this wasn't happening 10 years ago. In social media, and other presidents did not come to Oklahoma to actually admit that there was a genocide here, there was ethnic cleansing, there was basically a war crime for all intents and purposes, because the military was involved. You had Trump come there last year and hold a rally, at the last Tulsa celebration. That shows you the influence that is happening on the ground. But things are starting to change.
Now that you mentioned the Trump piece, I do remember that, and I believe he was actually, now that I think about it, I believe he was going to have a rally the same day, and people kind of had some outrage, like, hey, what are you doing? Yeah, okay, that was Juneteenth. Okay, get them a little bit mixed up. They were close together. Okay, no, that makes sense. The other thing that popped in my head when you were talking about the genocide with the Armenians, let's also remember Oklahoma just recently had that ruling, last year, that a large portion of the state's getting returned to the Native Americans. So, in a federal case.
In a federal
case. It'll be interesting, I saw something, I didn't get a chance to really look at it with Ben Crump. He was going to talk sort of about the legal strategy of what he saw at least for reparations in regards to Tulsa. It will be interesting with a court, granted that was based on a treaty, but with that type of a landmark type of ruling where they say, hey, essentially this land is returned back to the Native Americans. Obviously we don't have a treaty, but does that make way for some sort of, larger than what we've seen, sort of recompense, returning of the area? Because I'm sure with gentrification and things like that, pieces of land were lost and things like that. Does that clear the path for something along those lines, either in addition to some sort of repayment as well, where you really run into a situation where you could rebuild some semblance of it?
So there's a lawsuit. There's multiple lawsuits on the table, and land is one of the main. I think it's in the top 5 by the advocates for Tulsa, the 20 lawyers that are fighting for those cases. So there's 7 defendants that they're suing. The Tulsa Development Agency and Tulsa Business Alliance and so on and so forth, that they're suing, to have access to the records, for one, and number 2, to transfer the land back to a land trust that would be safeguarded by the Greenwood, the Greenwood project.
Yeah, so I mean, all things to keep an eye on. Like I said, it's nice to see that finally there's national exposure. I don't think at this point, like I said, different pockets of people had heard about it over time. Like I said, I heard about it about 5 or 6 years ago, but now with all of the publicity that is gotten on the news and other areas, there should be no excuse anymore for people not knowing this, whether they be younger kids who were in school, because I would hope schools have covered some mention of this, as well as for adults who, for whatever reason, didn't learn about it, didn't hear about it. So I am glad that, like I said, there has been some sort of recognition and apology. It's just I hope that that momentum continues, and it can set a precedence for, like I said, instances around the country, because this was not the only one, and not only bringing awareness, but making people whole. So that's all I have, Mike.
All right, like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you get all the updates.